When I was asked to participate in this lecture series, we got on the conversation of dissent. Dissent as a concept coming out of the Anglo-American world, and wondering whether dissent was something that was possible in the Netherlands. This came to me when I was asked last June. This came to the forefront also with another experience I had. I was asked in June of last year to introduce Bernadine Doorn, who was a member of the Weather Underground in the United States in the 1970s. And she has a kind of a guest professorship at the Free University, comes over once a year to give a few classes. And this is somebody who had been a fugitive from the law for 10 years before turning herself in and spending about a year, I think, in jail. But somebody who remained kind of, I think, a self-styled radical activist. And she spoke to this group of Dutch people at the Free University in which she said about education, it is the duty of people to rebel. And this is something you have to teach children, that it is a duty to rebel. The Dutch audience was relatively nonplussed by this assertion. But what we see then in this particular case was also a kind of question mark, duty to rebel. And as she explained it, she really came to use the word dissent to describe what she meant. She didn't mean rebel in a kind of physical, act of physical resistance, but to dissent. To politically maintain a firm line against everything or most of what is. The Dutch have developed a reputation for tolerance in the last 40 years, that maybe in the last 5 years could be changing some. But in the last 40 years, developed a reputation that has been primarily, it seems to me, oriented toward the acceptance of people from different lifestyles. What polls, however, have always indicated about the Dutch is that the Dutch are very, very uneasy about forms of political radicalism. They see this as being dangerous to the public order. They see this, at the very least, as a kind of a form of fanaticism that borders on the asocial. For a country that's concerned in its own way about social cohesion, also a term you hear a lot about these days, political radicalism, kind of a political firmness of principle seems undesirable. So even if it is there, it must be tightly put within constraints. And it made me wonder about the place of dissent in Dutch history and why dissent, maintaining a firm political line, has been difficult in this country. And when I mean dissent, I mean, in the first instance, I'll just do a very simple definition, to differ in opinion or feeling. And secondly, the refusal to conform to authority. And the refusal to conform to authority in respect to an established church, or I would expand it to an established political body. Dissent has all kinds of contexts. You can think about it in lots of different ways. There's such a concept as, for example, organizational dissent, which some business models essentially want to put into their plan. But I'm really going to focus on political dissent tonight. Dissent can obviously come from the left, it can come from the right. Dissent can be oriented toward the future, or it can be oriented toward the past. Milan Kundera, for example, talked about his dissent in communist Czechoslovakia as, and I cited here, a remorseless nostalgia and remorseless skepticism. So dissent doesn't always have to have a future orientation, but it can also have something that tries to remember the past, in this particular case, pre-communist Czechoslovakia. Dissent can be elitist, it can be populist, it can be communitarian. I think it's very important also, especially for intellectuals, to realize that dissent is not necessarily only an intellectual exercise. Two important qualifications that I would want to give on the concept of dissent before moving on is that dissent, as I interpret it, and as others interpret it, means non-violent resistance. It might mean civil disobedience, but it does not mean revolution. It does not mean going to the barricades and taking up muskets and firing at the soldiery or the police. Dissent, in this particular case, really does mean non-violent dissent. And last point that I want to make in this respect is dissent is more than just disagreeing about an issue. It's not just about, well, I am opposed to getting rid of automobiles on this street, and I am going to dissent from the city council's vote. Dissent is a wider orientation. Dissent is a wider set of attitudes that has a wider critique of society. So when I mean dissent, I'm thinking about people who themselves imagine another reality, one that favorably compares with the existent. So people who are dissenters are people who say, the reality as we know it right now in its wholeness, or at least in a great deal of its wholeness, is unsatisfactory, and I have another vision for how it ought to be. Now, is it true that dissent has not existed in the Netherlands? Dissent as I've just defined it. Well, it's a big claim. I say it's impossible in my title. Impossible is a word that historians should never use, and so I'm going to say that, of course, there have been historic moments when dissent has been more evident in the Netherlands. You might think, for example, of the patriots of the 1780s, who laid on a different kind of framework in contrast to the vision, or at least the arrangements of the old Dutch Republic. You might think, for example, of Thorbecke in the 1840s as a liberal dissenter from the conservative regime of Willem II. You might think, for example, of the relatively young Abraham Kuyper in the 1870s as he got his anti-revolutionary party going and sought, in effect, to transform the Netherlands, the time before he essentially settled into a modus vivendi. You might think of Ferdinand Domela Nieuwenhuis of the same period, anarchist who had his own alternate vision. Perhaps, too, you can think in this century of the 1960s of people who very consciously thought about being dissidents. There are a number of Dutch people who took over the idea of civil disobedience, for example, from Martin Luther King and the United States, and sought to transport that to the Dutch situation. And of course there are other figures we can also think about: the squatters, provosts, kabouters, dissenters, perhaps all in their own way. You can ask yourself how deep that vision for an alternate society was in some cases, but dissenters at least plausible. In H. Stuart Hughes' book about European intellectual dissenters of the 70s and 80s, there's one Dutch figure who comes up in his book. Eduard Schillebeeckx. The Dutch, well actually, the Belgian theologian who as a Catholic theologian dissented in a systematic way from the more traditional doctrines of the Roman Catholic Church. Schillebeeckx is an important intellectual in the Netherlands and outside of it, and he's the only Dutch, he's lived in the Netherlands for a long time, the only Dutch person who figures in Hughes's study. So there are, of course, moments, times, especially in those moments when Dutch society is politically, economically, socially changing. Then at those moments, of course, there are voices that come out and say, I have this critique of the status quo, and I want the people of this society to deal with my concerns and with my vision. But I think by and large those moments have been relatively fleeting and few, and that it has not by and large determined political life in this country. Why is that the case? I think there are 5 reasons for it, and I want to lay those out for you tonight. The first is that The Netherlands, historically speaking, is a country of minorities. And the question is how dissent then can play a role. Since the 16th or 17th century, the Dutch have had to deal with religious difference. They've had to, in effect, tread on eggshells round each other in order to make this society work. Work in the sense of not degenerate into violence and chaos. Dutch have struggled then, you could say, for the last 400 years with seeking for a kind of modus vivendi. It's a very different kind of project than either stifling dissent or trying to generate a vision of a dissenting community. So I think that there's been a kind of a pragmatism, you can say, oriented toward the modus vivendi that has taken pride of place here. This system of minorities becomes institutionalized, or this tradition of minorities becomes institutionalized in the late 19th century through the well-known colorization, as problematic a term as that is. System of proportional representation introduced in the Netherlands in 1917, 1980, in which these various minorities all get their relative share of the public good. So you have in the Netherlands then essentially a country of minorities. Minorities who essentially have a fragmenting effect on at least some aspects of Dutch society. What then does dissent mean in this context? Well, you can ask the question whether dissent has any meaning at all if there is no clear light culture against which to dissent. So, in a country of minorities, who's dissenting against who? It's very, very difficult to figure out. You might say that the liberals are the oldest and still in social economic terms, the most dominant of the groups, and that you sort of shoot your arrows at them, but they too had become a small group. Everyone, you could say, had equally become a dissenter or not one at the same time. What you get then as a result, certainly by the 20th century, is a public space that is not interested in either persuading or in repression. It's not about either repressing dissent or about dissenters coming up and trying to make their case. It's really about several viewpoints existing next to each other, perhaps formally in some kind of critical dialogue with each other, but in effect not. Each group gets its own right to say its own things, but there really isn't anyone listening outside it. So it's for the own group, and it's not for the other group. So in that sense, it doesn't really make any sense to speak of dissent in this context. You could argue that dissent does occur in the Netherlands on a subcultural level, that among Protestants themselves, or among Catholics themselves, or among socialists themselves, there are patterns of dissent where minorities come up and say, hey, this is not the direction we should go. You could say, for example, the foundation of the Communist Party of Holland is a kind of dissent against the SDAP's own vision of society. But then this is solved by the CPH going off and essentially doing their own thing. So, again, to what extent we can speak of dissent in this context, I think, is a big question mark. Dissent is there, but it's not a primary part of the political culture. This doesn't mean that the Dutch never acted as a majority culture. Certainly they did. You can think, for example, of the storming of the Communist Party building, Felix Meritis, in 1956, when there's a kind of a reaction against the invasion of Hungary, and where communists, in trying to resist this, take on the kind of a role of dissenter against a huge majority. But by and large, those moments are few. In a country of minorities, dissent is not particularly relevant. You could argue that this also takes place later on, as time goes on. It has been argued by Rob Thielman, among others, that homosexuals, in emancipating themselves in the 1960s, essentially were given all the kinds of accoutrements, all the kinds of support that the pillars before them had been given. And so that there, too, you cannot really speak of the rising movement of homosexual emancipation as being a dissenting group. Again, problematic, Purple September, lesbian group, dissenting, certainly in style, so there are some moments there, but by and large, compared to other nations, I think more problematic to characterize these movements as dissenting movements. What about religious groups, Orthodox religious groups? Well, as Sarah Barca has also explained in her story, Orthodox Protestants by the late 1960s largely accepted the secularization of Dutch society, at least some of them did. And so they too, they were off in their own marginal group, but they accepted the boundary between the secular and the religious. They were in their own world, and the secular was in its own world, and they certainly did not see themselves as dissenters trying to regain traction in that society, by and large. So I think this is also very important to note. And the question is whether certainly immigrants themselves, in this context, to what extent they themselves might, or a group of them might see themselves as dissenters. There's not a lot of history, at least, that would either encourage them to become dissenters or for the Dutch themselves to accept their role as a possible source of dissent. This tradition that you get out of a country of minorities, a good thing or not? It's a difficult question. I have mixed feelings about this legacy because in some ways this country of minorities, with its benign neglect, with indifference as its chief virtue, really yielded some good things. I mean, in the sense that relative lack of violence, relative judicious division of goods, but at the same time it yielded a lack of dissent, lack of a firm vision of what otherwise might be. And I think that's also the price the Dutch paid for this. Related to this is a second point, and that is the relative weakness of what you can sort of say a dissenting political tradition. And that's really associated with the first point, but I think it's also separate from this. And I'm speaking now really out of the Anglo-American tradition, although I could speak out of other European traditions, but to make one point of reference. Dissenters comes from the British context. And a dissenter was somebody who did not belong to the Church of England and wanted to essentially establish another version of Protestantism in its place. This dissenting tradition yielded a revolution, certainly in England, arguably also in time in the United States. And so you see a religious tradition transforming itself, a religious critical tradition transforming itself into a critical political tradition, which had its own effects. Over time, this critical political tradition became part of a loyal opposition, but also certainly a tradition that was willing to dissent, to speak against the existing order. It is also out of this tradition, for example, that you get the beginnings of the tradition I just mentioned, civil disobedience. Henry David Thoreau from the 1840s comes out of the Puritan tradition, initially in England, moved over to the United States, goes through all kinds of transformations into Thoreau's day in the 1840s, which in turn has its effects on the civil disobedience of Martin Luther King about a century later. So you have a kind of a radical Protestant dissenting tradition that obviously has its effects in the United States and in Great Britain. I don't think there's anything quite like that in the Netherlands. There are certainly dissenting traditions, dissenting religious traditions back to the 17th century, if not before, but these do not in the same way translate themselves, with the exception, I think, of the 1780s, into a real firm political vision for a different kind of society. I think tied to this to this absence of a religious political tradition in the Netherlands is that there is also in the Dutch religious traditions an absence of a really striking religious imaginary. That what you see, I think, in Dutch Calvinism, Dutch Catholicism, these have rich traditions in their own ways, but what they do not really have is an apocalyptic tradition. You can say thank goodness, but they don't have an apocalyptic tradition that essentially imagines a new heaven and a new earth as something that might just be within the reach of human beings. Not particularly emotive cultures, and not particularly eschatological in their orientation. Very, very hard to imagine this tradition yielding a kind of I have a dream vision of politics that you see, certainly in American political history, for example. And I think connected to these things is also generally a lack of a kind of utopian vision that you see also in the artistic and the intellectual communities of the Netherlands. So you don't have a radical dissenting form here. I'll say something a little bit more about the intellectuals later. A third point that I want to raise, and I think a third factor that I think is very, very important, is this Dutch tradition of consensus. Consensus, of course, is a word that's being used all the time, and often still has positive connotations. Not by everyone, but still generally positive connotations. Why would anyone be against it? And certainly, consensus politics has yielded many fruits. I'm in some ways an admirer of Dutch consensus politics. But there are some shadow sides to it, and some of them are related to this question of the absence of dissent. An Israeli researcher came to the Netherlands some years ago to study Dutch euthanasia policy. And he was charmed with Dutch euthanasia policy when he came here. But when he left, he was alienated from Dutch euthanasia policy. The reason? Because everyone he interviewed thought it was a good policy. In Israeli culture, where dissent is also something that's very, very strongly developed, the absence of dissent is itself a warning sign that something is wrong. That if everyone is agreed with each other, then there must be something people are covering up, or it must mean that something at the very least is being overlooked, and that somebody really got to get on the ball and offer some critique of the status quo. So I think that's indicative of a possible problem with consensus. The whole point of consensus, after all, is to create, as the Dutch say, maatschappelijk draagvlak. And I'm not sure how you would translate that. Social. Yeah, at least you want to create a kind of social support. You want a wide social support for a policy, so that this is something that takes in as many people as you possibly can. And in effect, you could argue, change dissenters or would-be dissenters into team players. People who put down their opposition and say, okay, well, if you give me a couple of sessions, I'll play ball with you and become part of this great consensus. So you don't think in terms of simple majorities, but you try to get as many people on board as is possible. So an example of this would be in my hometown of Amersfoort, where the coalition now governing the city consists of 28 of the 39 seats in the city council. And recently there was a vote about the budget, and they really wanted unanimity on the budget. So when the opposition SK said, you know what, we have some problems with the budget, we're going to vote for it. Huge clap, right? The SK would come in and join with the others. And when the Burgerpartij Amersfoort says we won't vote for it, then there was almost booing in the room that you'd still have these 3 or 4 deputies that would decide not to vote for the budget. So it's important in some sense to have as wide a wide support for a policy. What does dissent mean in this context? It means a number of things. In the first instance, it means that you voice your opposition for a limited time only. You voice your opposition for a limited time only. You're allowed a certain range of time, a certain amount of time to voice your opposition, to voice even your strong opposition. But at some point, you will be expected to sign on to the great consensus that is developing on a certain policy. If you don't do that, and you continue to voice your opposition, then you might get a response in Dutch. Dat is een gepasseerd station. So, we've already passed that station. We can't go back to that. We've already been there, we've done that, we're moving on, and dissent on this point really is not, it's not so much that it's morally wrong, but it's just not politically and socially handy to do that. Okay, so I think that's one thing. I think another effect is that it means that the leaders of society themselves become a kind of broker between various parties, rather than pursuing to take a, by manner of contrast, a kind of prophetic dissenting role. I notice that myself as being a professor and a public intellectual in the Netherlands, that there are certain kinds of expectations that are made for me. The advice I got, for example, in coming to Dutch University 4 years ago, was that it might be expected of me that from time to time I would issue a couple of sharp statements about this or about that. That I would just show that I was pugnacious enough and insightful enough to really make a couple of sharp statements about the status quo. But not too many. Because there are other roles, other functions that I would be expected to play. The role of the diplomat, the role of the organizer, bringing various people together, showing that I'm also a team player. It's very, very different, I would say, from the Anglo-American university world. The Anglo-American university world, in general, is much less relevant to their societies. They're much more on the fringes of society. American academicians, in particular, play very little role in political and social life. What they win from it is a kind of splendid isolation in which they, in fact, get to function 24 hours a day as dissenters, as people who can say, I'm against this, look what politics is about in this country, and it's going totally in the wrong direction, and this is the direction we should go. In that sense, you certainly see my American colleagues as being radical dissenters, people who as a class and as people working at universities take on the stance of dissenters, as people who stand over and against much of the existence. There's nothing remotely like that in the university world that I know in the Netherlands. It's not to say that people aren't, that my colleagues aren't critical about particular directions in society, and they can't say sharp things from time to time about this or that. I even have a few colleagues who, in fact, are quite irascible, quite dissenting in their orientation. I even had a colleague who, for being so, was severely chastised by his dean and was, in fact, in his annual report, in his annual evaluation, told that he was expected not to make such statements in the future. So, a relatively extreme example, but certainly something that is strikingly different from the United States. So, dissenting opinions have their time and their place. They may, in fact, be useful, but they are not expected to be a lasting presence. Lasting dissent is not something that is expected or desired in Dutch society. I think that's illustrated by one last example, and that is how some public issues are framed. The government might say, for example, we are now going to have a maatschappelijk debat, a social debate, and we're going to start it now, and then we're going to close it, afsluiten it over 6 months or a year, and we've heard everything we need to hear, and then we've had that phase and we can move on to the decision-making process. In some ways very natural, you're at least allowing some kind of room for the participation of the public. But the idea of debate going on forever and ever, the idea of dissent being something that people might continue on for the rest of their lives, dissent as a kind of a stance, I think that there's relatively little room given for this in Dutch consensus culture. The fourth point, and these points are shorter, I think that this also ties into a relative lack of politically oriented citizenship. That citizenship itself is not something that the Dutch have historically been strong on. Some researchers have suggested that Dutch visions of citizenship historically have been quite passive. In some ways, I would argue that the Dutch sense of citizenship historically has been quite active. If you look at what citizenship meant 50 years ago, for example, what it meant was participation in het verenigingsleven, being a member of an association on your local level primarily, and that this was a way for you to essentially exercise your responsibilities to society. Sometimes they called it burgerschap, citizenship, and sometimes they didn't, but that was the essence of it. But citizenship as a kind of political stance, as a political orientation, relatively undeveloped in Dutch society as a concept. There was a manual about citizenship on the local level in 1967, and there were 3 responsibilities it articulated for citizens. There were 3 things that as a citizen of a locality you were expected to do. One was to vote. The second was to read about the discussions in the city council. And the third one was to discuss it with your neighbors. And that was it. So, and it's, you might run for council, there might be other kinds of things, but this was the essence of it. 60s changes this a bit, and you get new forms of participation, new forms of extra-parliamentary participation. You see this also in the great demonstrations of the 1970s in the Netherlands. So there are moments, again, where citizens move out, a relatively short period, but they certainly are there. But still, after that, falling back away, a relatively empty understanding of what political citizenship means. Recently, there has been new attention to that. But again, I think that government itself feels torn about what it wants. It wants active citizens. It talks about that. But what does active citizenship mean? Active citizenship means primarily being a volunteer, showing a kind of interest in political events in general. What it does not mean, I think almost explicitly what it does not mean, is dissent. It does not mean essentially setting up or developing a vision that is alternate, different from the powers that be. It's not about taking a contrarian stance. I think that's something that is seldom mentioned, if at all, in some of the citizenship literature. So I think there still is a kind of uncertainty about what is the nature of dissent within the context of citizenship. And fifth, and the last point, is that I think one of the reasons why dissent has not really developed in the Netherlands, as much as it has in at least several other countries, is that it is not a country whose perceived past is one of great injustice. Rosie Bradotti and Marlene Dumas talk about the Dutch tendency to forget about their past, or at least to sort of relativize the violence of various aspects of their past. That happened a long time ago in a far away place. World War II, I think, is an important exception, and I think that discussions about World War II in the 60s and 70s led some Dutch to resist, for example, the census. 1971 was the last time the Dutch organized a census, in large part because of public resistance to it. Also, a resistance against identification papers being mandatory on the basis of the experience of the Jews in the Netherlands during the Second World War. So in some ways, the experience of the Second World War and the lessons learned therefrom was a trigger in the 1960s, 1970s, at least briefly, for dissent against the order. But by and large, I think that assertion holds, that if you take a look at Dutch discussions about their past, that this is not a past which is remembered as one in which great injustices need to be revisited and addressed. I think that's different, certainly in the example of the United States, where, to take one very big example, slavery, not the only one, but slavery is one of those issues. So in this sense, the Dutch have had a relationship to their past that I think has not encouraged dissent, and part of that really does have to do with the actual historic record that the Dutch, in comparison to other countries, have not been engaged in the same kind of bloodletting, the same kind of violence that has visited other countries. But what about now? Here I want to close. What about now? What about today? I've given reasons why dissent has not really been a sustained element of Dutch public life. But it says really nothing per se about the present. What is the role, or what can the role of dissent be nowadays? In the first place, I'm not sure that the opportunities for dissent are particularly great now. I think part of that has to do not so much with the Dutch situation, but with essentially the fate of dissenting groups across many parts of the globe. You have a fragmentation of publics. Which groups are we talking about? Where do you, to which groups do you direct your dissent? I think that's all become much more difficult. And so that dissent takes on a kind of a piecemeal character than it maybe did a generation ago. I think in that sense it may be more difficult than it was in the 1960s or the 1970s. A second thing I think is tied more to the Netherlands, and that is that I think you still are left in a world where there is a really heavy emphasis move toward consensus. I think in the 1990s it was a different kind of consensus than it is now. I think that there was an important shift around the turn of the century. But arguably we've gone from one form of consensus to another. There's still certain things being fought out, but you could argue the Dutch have traded one form of consensus in for another. At least they're working heavily on creating that new consensus now, so that you're not so much getting an open field now, but just a different kind of consensus. And last is that I think it's also important to notice that, this is something that Paul Schnabel has said, is that most Dutch, just like most people in Western Europe, actually think alike and act alike in most ways. So who would the dissenters actually be? Who can we imagine? And he named one group. He thought maybe the people who really believe in a kind of sustainability, have kind of a vision of sustainability in a kind of discernible, radical way. We are only going to live in ways that are sustainable. But again, the question is, how many different sources and resources of dissent actually are there? But I do actually see some new opportunities for possible places of dissent. Globalization obviously leads to all kinds of new ways to get into contact with each other and to think of new ways to re-engage, critically re-engage the societies in which we live. I think that globalization is very, very important, not just for getting new ideas, but for the rediscovery or the discovery of traditions, of deeply rooted practices and ideas that can give us ideas about how possibly to dissent. So I think that that's a new resource that I think has been gaining traction in the last 10 or 20 years. Another development I think is also taking place in the Netherlands, whether one likes it or not, is that arguably, precisely because this is turning into a majoritarian culture where people think mostly alike, it's precisely in that kind of culture where most people think alike and have the same kind of political and social instincts that dissent becomes possible. That in a country of minorities, dissent was not something that really could find any place. But in a country where most people think alike, it is actually possible to critically engage that majoritarian culture in a way that had not been the case before. And finally, I would say that the very interest in citizenship itself raises new possibilities for dissent, particularly about who should belong, who is part of the new citizenship, who are our fellow citizens, what does citizenship mean? Thank you for listening to me.